Hi folks, this is Praveen Kumar from Informatica Global Customer Support. Today in this session we will have a walkthrough of various MRS startup issues. So the agenda for this session is as shown on the screen. Firstly, we'll have a brief overview of what is MRS. This will cover basic introduction to MRS, and then it will be followed by the details of where are the various logs of an MRS located, and then we will be walking over certain basic startup issues and their symptoms and the solutions, followed by some troubleshooting tips which can be considered while troubleshooting startup issues, and at the end we'll have references to certain KB articles that are referenced over in this video. So what is model repository service? The model repository service is just a service which manages the model repository. So now what is the model repository? So the model repository is the metadata store. So the model repository service stores the metadata created by Informatica products in a relational database to enable collaboration among the products. The products could be developer, the DIS, analyst service, search service, etc. Okay, so every object in MRS is called as a model. That's why the name as model repository service. So every object in MRS is a model created using Informatica's proprietary framework called as IMF, Informatica Modeling Framework, and this model is language independent and can be persisted and retrieved without concerning about their implementations. Now, what is this MRS and how do we identify an MRS process in a set of processes, right? So MRS is actually a Java process and is an immediate child of the node, and it is also a parent of a child process which is actually its MRS cache. So the MRS cache process is used for optimizing performance in fetching information from the MRS DB. Now this database of MRS can be Oracle, can be DB2, can be SQL Server, and the interaction between the MRS and the MRS database happens using JDBC drivers along with the Hibernate layer in between. So let us now have a walkthrough of how do we find the MRS process, and how do we find its PID and a few details about it. Okay, yeah, so this is my server where Informatica is running. So let us, for example, find out where is the MRS running right now, or I mean what is the PID of the MRS right now. So let's say if I search for MRS, I would get to know that there is an MRS running here, and you can see that it would have the name of the MRS restored is the name of the MRS I'm having here, and also you can see the PID of this is 14625. Okay, so let us try to find out some details about the parent process. So let us find out which is the process which is actually the parent of this MRS service we see here. So as you can see, 14806 is my PID and 14625 is the parent process ID. So once I press enter, I would get the process 14806. Now let me see which is the process which is the parent of this, that is 14625. So 14625, and when we do that, we find out that this is actually the node process. Okay, and that's about it. And then we have process which would have its PPID as 14625, 806, that is the child process of MRS, and that should be our cache process. And as you can see the below one, this is the cache process of MRS. Okay, so let's get back to the video. And yeah, so it is important to know how to find the PID of the process, because we need to know whether during startup issues is the PID of the process already running or not. Then it could eventually turn out to be rather the connectivity issue rather than a startup issue to us, right? So the different ways to find the PID would be, you can go to the console and find the way we did just now, or you can also go for the admin console logs tab and go to the services tab and add a column for the PID, which will also show the latest PID of the MRS service process if you filter on the MRS service accordingly. So this is one important need why we went through this experiment. So let us get back to the presentation now. So the service logs from the file system and the service logs from admin console. So these are the main two places where the MRS writes its logs. Now the location where we write the MRS logs is very much important to know, because when you are dealing with debugging the issue of startup, we have to look for these set of logs, and the first two are the most important logs for debugging an MRS startup issue. So what would happen here is the service logs of the files, the MRS writes its log into the file system in infahome/logs node name services model repository service MRS underscore MRS name n.log, where n can be a number between 0 to 9. So this is a log rotation. For example, you can see in my example there is a demo MRS. So MRS underscore is always prefixed with their MRS name, and then followed by a number which is between 0 to 9, and the log with the name 0 contains the latest log. There is also another way of getting the MRS log is by going to the administrator console logs services. In the actions, you can export the logs and choose the log types as service as MRS, and choose your appropriate MRS service in the dialog there. Eventually both of these are MRS logs. However, there is a discrimination between these two, is the service logs from the file system are more detailed compared to the logs which are present in the administrator console, but the administrator console logs are more easy to read and easily accessible as compared to the service logs which are present on the file system. Eventually, when you are working with Informatica support, it is preferably to get the service logs from the file system in first place, and then also, if possible, you can even share the administrator console log if the logs entries are too much, right? And then we have domain logs coming in. So domain logs are the is a important log location, because it is the parent of the MRS process. The node is a parent of MRS process. So anything, if the service of is not even able to create a Java process itself, like say there is an issue with a JVM command line or something like that, then you would see that MRS would not be even able to write its logs. In those cases, the actual error would be thrown directly into the domain log, and that is where you can fetch it up from the administrator console logs tab domain. You can click on the action and click on the export logs to get the log for the type called log type equal to domain. So when you do that, your logs for the domain will be exported based on the timelines you have chosen in the dialog. Now next comes your JSF communication log. So this log is not so very much important for startup issues, but this is also a log which will be GCS interested in, because this log would contain the details of the communication layer of the MRS. So in Informatica, all the clients and services communicate using a beep protocol, and we have an Informatica proprietary API called JSF for communicating across these logs, across the services and the clients. Now these client and service communication, if there are any kind of errors or any kind of warnings, then those messages would be going into this JSF log. But ideally in a startup scenario, the service would still be coming up, so I would not expect JSF log to have much useful information, but however it is useful to have a look when we are looking at other logs too. And the format is always as shown in the screen: infahome logs node name services model repository MRS name underscore JSF log. So so your MRS name will be suffixed by jsf.log at the end, and the log would be written in the node 01 services model repository service folder. And the demo MRS, as you can see on the screen, it's an example from my in-house environment. So let us have a look at what all the different common startup issues which we can observe, and which are the common issues which customers have been repeatedly hitting, and we are observing cases coming in for them. So first part of the issue, or first category of the issue, would be the model repository service database misconfiguration, and then there is a file system issues, and there are port issues, and there are database consistency issues. So this is the most commonly observed issue, and it happens mostly with the initial creation of the MRS, or where users are actually doing certain DB related activities, and there is an configuration which has to be reverted back into, or enabled into, the MRS configuration in the admin console is not properly done. So the most common is the JDBC URL is incorrect, or the user account credentials are not proper, or the JDBC URL. So we need to use the JDBC URL based on the DB server configuration, and say for example you have migrated your database from one database to another, or even database type to another database type, then you need to appropriately update it. And for that you need to go through, configuring your database to meet the database requirements, as well as you have to ensure that your connectivity to the database is working fine. And for testing your JDBC level connectivity, you can use this tool and JDBC test utility, and you can refer KB 192305 for finding the same and how to use the JDBC test utility. Similarly, there is another thing called as the connection timeouts. So whenever you are configuring a JDBC connection, you need to ensure that the database is reachable and has a strong network connectivity with minimum number of hops. Now this I would suggest you, because MRS needs to interact with the MRS database a lot, and there is a high chance that you would see a general slowness, causing slowness across products for your environment if you have a weak or not so good network connectivity between your MRS and your MRS DB, because everything in the platform depends on the MRS to share the metadata, and every time the metadata is fetched, it would take a longer time. And so it holds good same thing for the monitoring MRS, where any kind of job is executed, the status of the job has to be updated to the monitoring MRS, and it would take eventually a longer time to update the status of the job to the MRS, and eventually cause slowness in future further executions as well. So coming to the file system issues, the file system issues are the issues where the file system gets involved, and the reason why the MRS is not coming up is related to it. Now we have seen a lot of cases coming up for this one, and the common scenarios which are seen are the four I have quoted here, but there are other few more as well. So what we can see here is the log directory, which is a location where the MRS writes its logs, and it is required for the MRS service process Unix user account to have read write permissions to this folder where it is writing. So there are cases where we see where the permissions are not working as expected, and in turn ends with these errors and startup of the process. So that is one scenario. Then the another scenario we see is with the work directory. So for the work directory, what happens is Informatica uses OSGI bundles for loading the libraries, and given the scenario that it is loading the jars and the files using this particular framework available, this framework creates a work directory, and the work directory needs to have required permission. So now where is the work directory? So the work directory is created in infra home services work underscore dir directory, and you can see for model repository service there will be a separate folder inside the work directory and it will be used by it. Now we have seen certain issues, so for example I can refer you to KB 514610, which is on the screen here. So you would face this message in the MRS log, and eventually it means that either you do not have permissions or there is some corruption in the work directory. So eventually cleaning up the work directory resolves the issue in most of the cases, and that is where this KB which is shown is referring to. Okay, so let us get back to the presentation. Similarly, the MRS has a search functionality, so for usage of searching within the MRS for objects. Now this search uh, actually uses the indexes that gets created in the MRS index location, which is configurable property in the admin console MRS service process tab properties. Okay, so there you can actually specify an index directory, and this index directory has to be appropriately having permissions for the Informatica Unix user account. And also there are cases where the MRS indexes has to be recreated manually, and you need to ensure that the indexes are recreated in few scenarios, and recreation of the indexes actually resolves the issue there. Okay, so similarly you have a space issue. Obviously this is very pretty common, where you might have a lot of services running or doing lot of logging operations on the directory, and if any of the log directory, the work directory, the search index directory, or even the gateway log directory gets filled, you would not be able to bring up your particular MRS for that reason as well, right? So similarly there is another corner issue which we have seen with Linux file system, where your file system is being accessed using a network file system something, and what would happen is the Linux uses some system call which has a seed generator call, and this random number generator causes an issue. So for example I can take you to this KB article which refers to this issue. So the important point to be noted is this: in this scenario that the MRS service process would come up but would be hung, and when you take the stack traces you would see this particular stack always actively as seen on the screen. So this is something issue which specific to Java on Linux when generating random numbers. So we, as it is not something as a bug or anything in the Informatica product, but since it is due to uh, not communication issue between the Linux and the Java APIs, then what we can do to overcome this issue is you can just add the -d java security.egd equal to file dev/urando to the end of the JVM process, and this would actually end up resolving your issue for the hang during the startup. So the next issue in the list is the jars missing. This is commonly seen with issues where in customer scenarios where they have recently installed, upgraded, or they are migrating from one server to another the installation, right? So during these operations, or whenever there is a file system issue and they had rolled back something, uh, rolled back the backup of the file system onto the file system server and restarted Informatica, you would see that these jars would be missing, and eventually you would not see the MRS coming up for a lot of class not found errors. So coming to the network issues, so there are multiple issues where network can also come into picture. So first thing is you have to ensure that your min-max port range is not exhausted. There are scenarios where we see in the node properties of the admin console, you can see there is a min and max port range for the node. So any services which are going to run on this machine would actually take those port ranges. Now these port ranges have to be accessible to outside world, wherever your clients are connecting from, and these port range are to be available to dedicatedly to Informatica. We have seen scenarios where no some other process is actually using this port range, and eventually when Informatica tries to come up, it's not able to get the port access. Then secondly, you would also see scenarios where sometimes the MRS process or some other process which was using those ports did not go down properly, and it would be running as an orphan process, and would have still taken the port range. So given you have a very less port range in that scenario, you would like to look for orphan processes. So it is always required for you to ensure that you have more number of port ranges which covers for all your service application process requirements, right? And then second one is the multicast enabled NIC. So in cases where you have multiple NICs or you have multicast enabled NICs, we see that the MRS does not come up with no such device exception, and most of the time by disabling multicast on the NIC resolves the issue. Have a database side configuration issue where you will end up having some configuration of the database which does not allow the Informatica's MRS Hibernate layer to not work as functionality at the functionality level. So we have certain requirements for you to ensure that the database, especially if you, for example, you are using SQL Server, then you need to ensure that you have read committed snapshot set and snapshot isolation is set to true. If you do not set this to, then you might end up with any kind of inconsistent issues with your database. And also it is required that time to time your username privileges have to be verified, and also when you are installing, you have to ensure that the required privileges are always present. There are also scenarios where there is a password expiry that happens for certain databases in some customer environments time to time, and they have to renew the password and accordingly update the passwords at the MRS, and they would be need to restart the MRS as well. Now here are some certain troubleshooting tips. Refer the logs. The first location where you have to see whenever something happens to your services is referring the logs. Now you know that the place of the logs, now you can see that if you search in KB, or if you search in any, or even if you get a recommendation from a GCS engineer or anyone who is having an expertise, they might talk to you about certain issues, but how would you confirm that your issue is the same issue as that of what was being discussed with you, right? So the only way to confirm is referring to the logs. Now before, also another thing you need to ensure is you can actually try to categorize your issue to be, is it a startup failure or is it a hang issue? So as you saw, right, I gave an example of a random number issue where the MRS process comes up, but there will be nothing logged on the stack and logged onto the logs, but you would see the process is still running, and taking a stack is the best option you could do at that time, and try to see what is the MRS process doing. And have a habit of taking regular backups, because that is very much useful for long life of the any kind of issues you face. Then you can actually, the main goal of taking backups regularly is to ensure that you have a valid backup of the exact and good metadata which is consistent from the previous backups, right? So if there is any metadata inconsistency issues, then you can actually roll back the backup from your previous ones, right? And then we always suggest to keep your JVM process XMX value to meet your requirements. So you need to set your XMX value appropriately to ensure that that your Java process does not go into out of memory errors due to improper XMX values. And also you need to ensure that when you are changing certain options of the JVM in the MRS service properties, you might end up adding an extra invisible or special characters, like say for example a new line character. you would not be able to see the new line character in the admin console dialog screen, but eventually the process would not come up because there is a new line and it would be considered as the next part of the command for the OS. Now what you can do to confirm the same is go to the domain log, and in the domain log you will find whatever error we see, and if there is any additional option or additional space in which can be seen in this logs, you can actually get rid of it and ensure that when you are updating the JVM options you are not adding any unnecessary characters in it. So these are the KB articles we referred in this video so far, and yeah, and yeah, we would love to hear from you, and you can reach out to us for any kind of topics you need for a video KB for by mailing us to supportvideos@informatica.com, or you can also tweet it in twitter.com and channel in fast support. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for listening.